I think the two leaders are, Bev, and that's very good news, very positive meeting. And on China, they had a very common position between Jacinda Ardern and Scott Morrison on Xinjiang, on Hong Kong, and on the South China Sea. And in other good news, New Zealand is supporting Australia's case against China around Bali at the World Trade Organization. So I think they're at pains to show there wasn't a gap at leader level on China policy.
Yeah. Do you think that gives Australia more support, regional support, against China?
I think it does, and it shows that New Zealand is looking beyond its immediate region and thinking globally. But really, the bulk of the meeting was on this shared agenda in the Pacific.
How much more should New Zealand and Australia be doing, though, to accelerate the rollout, talking of the Pacific, of vaccines to the region?
Quite a bit. So the two Prime Ministers committed to comprehensive vaccine coverage in the South Pacific at the earliest opportunity, but current plans are falling well short. Australia's putting about 20,000 doses into the Pacific, separate to the COVAX program, and we're making 1 million doses a week down in Melbourne. So we could vaccinate whole small Pacific countries really rapidly. You know, Samoa has about 200,000 people, about half the population of Canberra. 1 million doses a week means we could have 2 doses for the South Pacific, except for PNG, in about 5 weeks, and we need to deliver it urgently at that kind of pace.
It's interesting because the government seems to be struggling with the rollout of the vaccine just in Australia. So is it hard to then juggle the Pacific nations as a priority, or should they be a priority?
They should absolutely be a priority. South Pacific countries' economies are about 40% dependent on tourism. The bulk of their tourists are New Zealanders and Australians. If we want to give them structural economic assistance in the pandemic, opening a travel bubble up with them is the best way, and doing a rapid rollout like we did with Samoa. Australian experts working with Samoan partners vaccinated the Samoan population against measles in 2019. We can do this at scale. We could open up country by country our Pacific travel bubble.
Well, if you consider, though, how delicately poised just moving between states in Australia is, how feasible is this travel bubble at this point unless both New Zealand and Australia really ramp up the vaccination programs?
Well, Bev, you're right. That is the critical path. And as I say, you know, Australia contracted for 50 million AstraZeneca doses. We're giving them to 9 million of our over 50s population. We've got huge spare capacity, and we've got capacity to work with South Pacific health partners, as we did in the Samoan measles outbreak, highly infectious disease, vaccinated that small population. It can be a priority, and it needs to be.
Let's go back to China, and particularly they move in where there are spaces, and we are seeing this in the Pacific, and particularly in the information area. China is doing a lot to occupy that and dominate the information area. Should our two nations be collaborating more to ensure it's not taken over? And that's the China message is the only message that's heard.
Yes, and interestingly, for all of our Australia-Pacific step-up, it's New Zealand that's really stepped up in Pacific media. Its Pacific media program isn't about getting New Zealand's version of Neighbours onto Pacific televisions. It's about quality content created by South Pacific journalists and New Zealand journalists going into New Zealand and the South Pacific. We could take that New Zealand model and do it here. $70 million a year would make a huge difference to the information that South Pacific Islanders are receiving, and not cede that ground to Chinese state media.
Do you think, though, that that has clearly not been a priority for successive governments in Australia?
I do, and I think it's been part of this domestic look at the national broadcaster. I think we've just got to be much more mature about this and use the best media outfit that we can. You know, maybe it's under the ABC charter, but a separate organisation. But the New Zealanders are doing this extremely well. We need to lift our game and join them.
And what are we competing with when it comes to what China's investing?
an enormous presence of Chinese state media with a whole lot of free Chinese government media product flooding the South Pacific. They're rebuilding some of the national broadcasters' facilities. They're funding documentaries where they dictate the content. It really, if we're not helping the Pacific stay a free media space with funding and with co-productions, we can see what's already happening.
And Michael, you know, it is interesting in terms of the way the relationship with China and Australia has deteriorated. What do you think it is about the way New Zealand is managing things that has not seen the relationship there deteriorate to the same extent?
I think they're just a smaller outfit, and they haven't taken some of the early decisions Australia has. They've followed Australia's decisions, 5G technologies being the best example. They've quietly followed the Australian decision, and Australia is the one that's influenced the global debate. That's why we've attracted Beijing's attention.
Indeed. Good to talk, Michael. Thanks so much.
Thanks very much, Bev.